So I think that one of the things, no, I know it was the thing that attracted me to Sunrise was this emphasis on telling real stories and individual people telling their stories about how they would be affected by the climate crisis, and how their friends and family are affected by the climate crisis. And it's a touchstone of Sunrise. It's one of the main tactics, humanizing the climate crisis. And I also think that that is one of the most important things that has helped with garnering the amount of BIPOC in the organization that we have. And I didn't explain, but BIPOC is like Black and Indigenous people of color, for anyone who doesn't know, because the sharing of stories, specifically the oral sharing of stories, is so integral to Black culture, to Latinx culture, and to a bunch of other cultures of people of color. And so the way that climate was being purported before the use of personal narratives, and even now by some other environmental organizations, leaves it to be distanced from the individual. And so therefore, I think that's also why still to this day, there are not a bunch of people of color in climate spaces, because you can't make it applicable to you or your tribe of people, the people that you care about. It's always seemed like something that was A, very far off, and B, something that wasn't as immediately affecting communities. And I think the use of stories has really changed that, both in climate spaces and outside of climate spaces.
All right. And do you have any interest in, and I know in that you use, that you're building of your own story as an example. I don't know if that's something that you're still into sharing.
I do. I use my own story literally all the time. And my friends have, every time I go to a protest or an action. So we all send to, especially like the leaders of Sunrise NYC, we all sort of have started to try to like cycle through variations of our stories, just so that when the people who are always there hear it, they can be like, oh wait, I heard something new that time. This was the 30th time I've heard that, but that was cool. That was new, that little 3-second bit right there. But yeah, so my personal story is I'm not from New York, I'm from Philadelphia, another big city. Have never been big on nature, actually, ever, until I was a grown adult who had lived in New York for 2 years. And then I was like, oh my God, where are the trees? So I'm from Philly, and I went to a very tiny private school on the outskirts of Philly on a scholarship for 6 years. That's a whole bunch of racial trauma, but we're not talking about that right now. So did that, and I went to college in New York, go to Marymount. And I have a really interesting relationship with my father. And so I hadn't seen him. Whenever I tell the story, everyone's like, where is she going? What we're bouncing around here. Yeah, so I have a really interesting relationship with my dad, and I hadn't seen my dad for 3 years when it came to my sophomore year of college. And by that meant that I hadn't seen the place that I grew up. So in going back after 3 years, I came in and I saw that the place that I grew up had changed radically. Because we're close to University City, which is where all of the colleges are in Philadelphia, what had happened was the legislation over the past 3 years had allowed developers to basically come in and buy up all of the land around the universities. And that was where I had lived. Now, there was a time when I was in middle school, and I went to a, like I said, tiny private all-girls middle school. There was like 3 Black girls in each grade. And I remember specifically, we would like be coming from volleyball games, and we would drive past my neighborhood and all of the girls would duck. because they were like, oh, we don't want to get shot in the ghetto. And it was like a game, and they would like duck, and I would like duck. And I remember very specifically the first time it happened, I had like just gotten there. I was in like 6th grade, and I ducked with them because I was like, yeah. And I was like crying under the seat. And one of the person who's my best friend now looked over and was like, are you okay? And I was like, absolutely not, but it's fine. So that was my experience. I lived in the hood. It's literally called Down the Bottom, but it was amazing. Like, there is such amazing community that comes out of poverty. And so when I went back, it turned into one of the most awakening moments of my life, because my home was gone. It was completely gone. The people that I had grown up with, the cultural touchstones that we had created were all gone. My dad is the last person that I grew up with on that block, which is insane to think about. A whole neighborhood, a whole culture, gone. And so when I started climate work, I remember hearing a story about someone who was worried about losing their home due to climate gentrification. And I remember talking to one of my kids, because I'm a teacher in New York, about how their home had been rushed in Sandy, completely and totally destroyed. And so when they went back, because they lived in public housing, when they finally got the chance to go back, most of the people who they had lived with were gone. And so I remember us having that moment of no longer having a home. And my connection to climate comes from that feeling. My passion about this work comes from that feeling. Because a lot of the times, one of the things that I talk about in my Sunrise work is dispelling the future narrative. Dispelling the narrative that the climate crisis is coming for us in 5 years, 10 years. There are people that I know, I have friends and family from Puerto Rico who have felt the climate crisis now. I know kids from the Rockaways who feel the climate crisis now. I lived in Harlem for a year, and I started developing weird breathing issues, like crazy, strange breathing issues, because of all of the trucks that they run out of there. Most delivery trucks actually run out of Harlem. My family has a history of asthma. I have never had any breathing issues, any respiratory issues, until that year that I lived in Harlem. And then moving out of there to Brooklyn, they all of a sudden disappeared. And there are a bunch of my kids in the Bronx. Most of my kids in the Bronx have asthma because of that purpose. Because of the fact that there are trucks and factories that are put there, because people don't care about their lives. So yeah, that's why I do this work. I know what it's like to lose your home. And I know people in my city of Philadelphia that live in the deep inner city, and I can see it now, how climate gentrification is going to be a thing, and has already started in New York, of people moving further inland because they're scared of flooding. So yeah, that's a little bit of a lot of it of my story, why I do the work that I do.
Dejah, that's a story that needs to be told so far and so wide and heard by billions of people.
And unfortunately, you're just on our podcast, so we can guarantee 20,
let's see.
Millions are coming.